Hello friends, in this lecture, we're gonna start learning the data types of the shading language. Okay, now we're gonna learn the most basic data types in the shading language. If you're coming from C#, these are going to be familiar for you. In GDScript, we also have these, but you might not know them because in GDScript, you can simply use the var keyword, which is what most people do, and then create a variable like that. And then you can assign anything you want to this variable. The shading language is a little bit more strict and it has some weird rules that we need to follow. First of all, let's start with the integer type. To create a variable, we first need to declare the type. That's going to be integer. Next, we need to give this a name. So let's say my integer. And then we can either finish the declaration by putting a semicolon or we can assign something to this. So I'm going to assign 10. So very simple stuff. This creates an integer, which is a whole number. So this needs to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers like that. It can't be, let's say 5.4 or 10.8 or things like that. So that's an integer. We also have a floating point type, which is called float. And this can hold a number with a decimal point, let's say 2.5. Both of these can be negative values as well, so you can put a minus in front of them to make them negative values. We also have a Boolean type, which obviously can be a true, what am I doing? My bool, a true or a false value. So we can set it like that. Each one of these we can use again, like this, to set them again to a different value. My float equals 10.23, and my bool equals true. Very simple stuff, works just like you would expect them to work. But this is where the weird stuff begins. Now we're going to talk about casting. The shading language likes to be very strict. So it's not going to allow you to, for example, to assign a floating point value to this integer. So let me try to do this. My integer equals 3.4. As you can see, we get an error telling us that we can't assign a floating point value to an integer. If you really want to do this, you need to cast it explicitly, like this. Now the 0.4 section of this floating point value is going to get discarded, and 3 is going to get assigned to my integer. Most programming languages do this by default, but the shading language doesn't let you do that. It's the same with this floating point value here. If I try to say my float equals, let's say 8, it's not going to allow me to do that. I have to do float like this, or there's an easier way of doing this, which is going to be simply putting a dot after the 8. The dot is going to turn it into a floating point value. You could also put a 0 if you want to really be explicit, but a dot is enough. So you need to pay attention to this while you're coding in the shading language, and you need to get used to, casting things to the correct type before assigning them. But other than that, there's not much else for us to cover. These are the most basic types that you can use, how to declare them. You could also make these constants like that, but then you can't modify them. So if it's a constant, you can't modify them. As simple as that. You could also take these and put them outside of a function, like that, but then you have to make them a constant, so you can't just leave them like that. As you can see, it says global non-constant variables are not supported. Let's see what it expected. Can we see the whole thing? Expected const keyword before constant definition, as you can see. Okay, let me think, is there anything else that we need to cover now? I don't think so. We have different data types, of course, but we're going to learn them as they come up for some of them, and for some of them, we're going to learn them in the upcoming lectures. But in this one, we learned the most basic ones. I don't need to delete that actually. Let's bring it back. So we're going to end it here and continue in the next lecture. In this one, we learned about the float type, the Boolean type, and the integer type, and the different types of rules we need to follow. We also learned how to make a variable constant.